Now back to Hanging with Hennig on 97.3 ESPN FM.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
And on the 97.3 ESPN mobile app, powered by First Bank of Sea Isle City.
I mean, that really got out of hand fast.
Streaming live on YouTube, Instagram, and the X platform.
Josh Hennig hanging out with you on 97.3 ESPN. As promised, joining us right now, we are on the weekend of SummerSlam invading New Jersey. And, you know, with John Cena, he's the big storyline right now in WWE. We are 29 years removed, though, away from the original great heel turn. And, you know, it's sad that Hulk Hogan passed away recently. Obviously, at 71 years old, he was a huge part of the trajectory of pro wrestling. And 29 years ago, he made the original heel turn that changed everything when NWO became part of pop culture forever. And the man to write about the new book that just came out, Say Hello to the Bad Guys, Marc Raimondi. You might know him for a long time covering MMA and the UFC. He now covers the Atlanta Falcons for ESPN.com. He also writes about the WWE, and he has the new book come out. And Mark, first of all, I appreciate you jumping on. This book is absolutely incredible. You done a great job chronicling everything, and it's just amazing that 29 years after Hulk Hogan made the great heel turn, we are now watching John Cena with his heel turn run. How you doing today, Mark?
I'm great, man. Thanks for having me, Josh.
So for you, you know, obviously you didn't know John Cena was going to turn heel, but was there a part of you that looked at Cena doing what he's doing now, and then in your mind you're like, man, this book is the perfect parallel for this because there's so many connections?
Yeah, absolutely, and you can't plan on when a book comes out, of course, because I've been working on it since 2021, so it's been a 4-year process, and I guess by good fortune, Josh, John Cena turns heel earlier this year, and the immediate comparison, and rightfully so, is the Hulk Hogan heel turn in '96, because that was, like you said, the gold standard of heel turns, the biggest heel turn ever. And John Cena's was pretty darn close because he was a guy that was the hero, the babyface, the good guy for 25 years. And I think people had kind of conceded that he would never turn heel after becoming that face of the WWE, in the same way that no one really thought Hulk Hogan would turn heel after being the face of WWF. And here we are, so it did work out kind of ironically.
And that's where I wanted to start with, because you mentioned Hogan. You document in the book that there was a time that Hogan wanted to turn bad guy. He wanted to do different things earlier in his career, and then WWF was against it. Looking back on that, Mark, is it maybe a conversation to be had that maybe Hogan should have done this earlier than WCW? Or do you think WCW, Bash at the Beach, and the NWO, was that the right place at the right time?
Well, it was absolutely the right place at the right time. And because, Josh, we're talking about this 29 years later, so it obviously made a pretty incredible impact, at that time in '96. I think that Hogan's instincts were correct, though, because he did want to turn heel after losing to Ultimate Warrior in 1990 at WrestleMania. And that was kind of his idea. And Vince McMahon said, I don't think it's the right time for that. But, Hogan's ability, and I've had so many people ask me over the last few months while I'm doing this book tour and then this press, what made Hulk Hogan special? And my answer to them is always something that is a little bit harder to put a finger on than just, oh, he was this, he was that. I think that Hulk Hogan's greatest gift was understanding what fans wanted and being able to harness that while in the ring as a wrestler, while in the ring doing a promo, and also outside of the ring, creatively. And I think that he knew in '90 that a change might have been a good idea, and it didn't work out then. And then, he goes to WCW in '94, and it's a good refresher for him, right? Because he's kind of doing the same shtick. He's still doing the Hulkamania stuff as the good guy, but it's in a new company. There are different, he has different opponents. So it's a little bit rejuvenating for him and for the product of WCW. But then after a while, that goes away, right? The new car smell wears off. And then you have to think about, what is the next act? How does he evolve from there? And it ended up being the biggest heel turn ever, and one that is still, you still feel the ramifications of that heel turn and this NWO storyline now almost 3 decades later.
You talk about in the book how everywhere you went, you found people who either wearing NWO shirts, giving you the Wolfpack symbol, pointing to your NWO shirt, and being like, maybe humming the music, right? For you, was it almost like as you wrote this book, as you worked on it, was there almost a part of you that was like, I didn't even fully realize the depths of this impact?
100%. And that was a lesson that I learned, Josh. Like I said, when like you just said that I wrote in the book, wearing an NWO hoodie on all of my road trips while I went to cover UFC events was so illuminating for me, because it really was almost every single time at the airport or at a gas station or at a random place to eat in wherever, in the United States and in Canada, that people would recognize the logo and say something and throw up the Wolfpack gesture. And, I mean, it was so cool to experience that, because it allowed me to kind of connect with my audience. That when you're writing a book, it's not that's kind of like a nebulous concept, like who am I writing for? What is my audience? And as I'm meeting these people at the airport, that's my audience, right? Those are the people that I want to write for. The people that, they may not have watched wrestling for the last 25 years, but when they were watching wrestling back in the 90s when the NWO started, it meant a great deal to them, so much so that they carried it with them to today. And that was one of my hypotheses for the entire book, because the subtitle is how the New World Order changed America. And that's why that's the subtitle, because all of these people who are just regular folks now, they may not even be wrestling fans anymore, but they were watching back then, and they took what they learned and what they watched, that entertainment, and they brought it with them now as adults, to whatever they're doing now in the workforce. That's with them. The NWO is with them. The Attitude Era is with them, and that's one of the key parts of the book, is how it shaped culture.
Marc Raimondi joining us here on 97.3 ESPN. The new book is Say Hello to the Bad Guys, plural, by the way. Marc Raimondi, who covers the Atlanta Falcons and WWE and more for ESPN.com. When you think about, you mentioned the cultural impact on America, I think one of the biggest things, and I'm only up to chapter 14, so maybe you get into this a little bit later in the book, but I think that one of the cultural impacts was it became cool for the anti-hero to be the hero. And we've seen like the rise of like comic book movies in the 21st century, and the popularity of, fringe characters like Blade, for example, right? The popularity of those characters, you almost can draw a connection to the NWO, and it was cool to be the NWO. It was cool to throw up the Wolfpack sign, whereas those type of concepts were very taboo before then.
100%, and that was why the NWO I think worked so well, because it was so of the time. And wrestling is I think the most like of the time entertainment medium, because it happens live every week, sometimes multiple times a week, right? And you can kind of ride the wave of what the fans want. And in the mid 90s, it was so clear that the fans wanted something else out of their wrestling, not the cartoony stuff that had come before it in the early 90s and in the 80s. They wanted something with more of an edge, because you saw pop culture changing. You saw music changing. It was no longer like the power ballads of the 1980s or the boy bands like New Kids on the Block of the early 90s. It was starting to become Nirvana and Pearl Jam, grunge music, gangster rap, NWA, Dr. Dre, West Side Connection, Ice Cube, right? Those were the ones that were becoming popular, and it was almost a counterculture revolution where everything got a little edgier, a little darker, a little grittier, and it gave way to the villain, like you said, and the anti-hero becoming the protagonist for the first time in wrestling at that level, because that's also what was going on in the world. And I always go back to this, Josh, like the 90s were so unique to me because everything was on television, and I was a kid. I was 11 years old when the NWO started, and then 2 years before that, or like a year and a half before that, was the O.J. Simpson trial. And that was almost like reality television because it was on court TV every single day. I'm like 9, 10 years old. I'm home from school because it's the summer, and my mom has it on every single day. So I'm there, as a kid watching a double murder trial involving one of like the country's great sports heroes, right? Like that was like so, you don't even realize as a kid like how like you lose your innocence almost like when you're a 9-year-old kid and you're hearing about murder every day. But that's kind of what was going on in the country. There were so many things that were more accessible to us. Like the 80s were a very like naive, innocent time. And the 90s were like, hey, in your face, the Menendez brothers, O.J. Simpson, murder, death. And that changes the culture. And I think, and I'm kind of deviating away from wrestling, but again, wrestling is able to harness that reality in a way and that mood and that vibe of the culture. And that's where things were in the 90s. And the NWO was such a perfect way to channel and funnel that kind of like counterculture that was going on in the world and in the U.S. because they were the villains. They were doing bad things, but they were doing it in a cool way, and it made you intrigued and compelled by what they were doing. And you couldn't help but to root for them, even maybe against your better judgment. They were cool, so you wanted to cheer for them.
And I think that's where you mentioned about the music, about how one of the things I've learned from the book so far is I didn't realize how deep that guys like Kevin Nash and Scott Hall were into like that rap music scene and how they, basically brought some of that information like to Hulk Hogan. They're like, hey, Hulk, we need to introduce you to what's going on in pop culture now. And that's a pretty interesting concept because like the fact that, Hogan had to be, for lack of a better term, explained to by Hall and Nash about like, hey, Hulkster, this is the world we live in now. And there was like, as you write in the book, Mark, there's a moment where Hulk Hogan was like, oh, now I understand.
Yeah, because look, think about who Hulk Hogan was by the mid '90s. He was a household name. He was a massive celebrity. He was no longer in touch with what was going on with the real world because he was kind of above it all, right? When you're that level of a success and that level of a famous person, you kind of become detached from what's going on. And Hall and Nash were nowhere near as famous as Hulk Hogan, and they were more kind of like in touch with pop culture and popular music. So Hogan was, he was almost like in Arrested Development a little bit from the 80s because that's when he became famous. And that was kind of the last time he was like a real member of society and not like a very rich and famous person. So Hall and Nash had to almost ground him a little bit, and they were very much into what was going on. Nash especially was very much into hip hop and rap, and that became a big part of the NWO. It was very much hip hop culture, black culture, and they use a lot of that stuff in what they were doing, from the gestures to the For Life came from Mac 10, the rapper, and a lot of that stuff. And Hogan was kind of in many ways along for the ride with them trying to kind of coach him on A, how to be a heel, and B, how to be more relatable to America in 1996 and 1997 and beyond.
Couple more from Marc Raimondi from ESPN.com, joining us here on 97.3 ESPN. The new book is Say Hello to the Bad Guys, 29 years from the greatest heel turn in sports entertainment when Hulk Hogan became the bad guy. You talked about, all the interviews, all the traveling that you did for this book, Mark. I want to know for you, was there a conversation, an interview, an experience that really stood out to you the most in the process of writing this book?
One of my favorite interviews, Josh, was a guy that not a lot of wrestling fans know. They don't know his name, but they know his work. I'll put it that way. His name is Ellis Edwards, and he was the stunt coordinator for WCW throughout the 90s. And he was the guy that rigged up Sting every single Monday to come down from the rafters. They did it every single week. They were up there for many, many hours, rigging him up before the show. And that is a guy that probably does not get enough credit, and he's not a guy that does a lot of interviews. And he was actually hired by WWF after the close of WCW to do their stunts, and he worked there for about 20 years. So he hasn't really been in the public eye so much, but his work was, I think, vital and integral to the feel and the vibe of the NWO, because he also did some of the early stunts that the NWO pulled off, like when the Outsiders and Six ran the Steiner brothers off the road and they flipped the Steiner brothers' car. That was a stunt that was done by Ellis Edwards. And, for the time in 1996 when that happened, that was like, holy crap. Like, this is like not any kind of wrestling that I've ever seen before. This is so unique, like a car flipping over. Like, that had not been done before. And Ellis Edwards was a guy that, he was a stunt coordinator, a Hollywood stunt coordinator for many, many years. He was the Baywatch stunt guy. So he had a world of experience that he brought to wrestling, and, an element that didn't exist in wrestling before, him and that period. And like the stories and the detail that he was able to go into about how he rigged up Sting and how they trained to even do that, and all the other things that he worked on with some of the vehicles that were used, like backstage and in the parking lots, and how he rigged those up and how they did those stunts. It was so fascinating to me because a lot of this story has been told before about 90s wrestling, but he has done so few interviews that it was like a treasure getting to talk to him, because he was able to kind of like fill in the blanks of so many things that people did not know about in my eyes.
Mark, before I let you go, because obviously I don't want to give away too much for the book, because I think everyone needs to read it, or like me, you're listening on Audible, just getting the full chronology, because you go way back into the origins of Hulk Hogan before he got to WCW, NWO, and everything. Looking at what John Cena is doing today, obviously this weekend is the huge SummerSlam here in New Jersey. When you look at what Cena's doing today and the quote unquote turning back the baby face that he's doing heading into SummerSlam, is there maybe some of what you're seeing that Cena is doing in 2025 is a bit him and the WWE learning from the mistakes of Hulk Hogan and WCW?
Potentially. I'm not sure if they're viewing it that way. I think that they were trying to come up with an idea for John Cena's farewell tour, because this is his last year, right? He's retiring in December, and they wanted to come up with something different, something creative, and the idea was to turn him heel. And that was something that the fans have been calling on for so long. And the heel turn, I thought, was just exceptional. That angle was just phenomenal with The Rock and Travis Scott and Cody Rhodes, and they all played their parts perfectly. It hasn't been the greatest follow-up to that, though, right? I mean, Hogan turned heel, and the NWO became the focal point of WCW for years after that. When John Cena turned heel, he became a focal point, but The Rock disappeared. You've only seen Travis Scott once since then, right? I mean, it hasn't really been the full-throated, commitment that WCW had to the NWO. And maybe it didn't need to be, right, for WWE, because they're doing so well. The rest of the card is doing so well, and there are other stars that have carried the programming. But I just don't feel like it's had the kind of impact that maybe they were hoping it would have, and certainly not the impact that the NWO with Hogan had. Now, I do think that I'm fascinated by where they go from here. I do think there'll be some more wrinkles to the story beginning this weekend, like you said, at MetLife Stadium in Jersey. And then, he's only got a few more months left. December is his last month. And I don't expect, Josh, that he'll retire as a heel. I think he'll go back to babyface. Now, I don't know if that's going to happen this weekend or it's going to happen a little bit down the road, but I just can't imagine that the last couple of months of John Cena's career are going to be as a heel getting booed. I don't think the fans want that. I really don't. In fact, I don't know if the fans have wanted that the entire year. I think that fans have pushed back against this heel turn. So I don't think it's really been the success that they were hoping it would be.
Interesting stuff. Obviously, all this stuff is very interesting. If you look at getting more behind-the-scenes information, the Netflix show is now out with WWE. And, of course, more information about the behind-the-scenes of all this is in Marc Raimondi's new book, Say Hello to the Bad Guys, How Professional Wrestling's New World Order Changed America. Get it wherever you get your books, online at Amazon, Simon & Schuster, or like me, you get it on Audible. And Marc Raimondi from ESPN.com joined us here on 97.3 ESPN. Mark, I really appreciate making the time. I'm thoroughly enjoying the book. Keep up the great work, my man. We'll talk soon.
Anytime, Josh. Thank you so much.